Alright, man, welcome back to another reaction. Today we got America's worst mountaineering disaster, the 1967 Mount Denali disaster. So now if you don't know, Mount Denali is one of the 7 summits. It is the tallest mountain in North America, residing in Alaska. Yeah, so let's not waste any more time though, and just get right into this one, man.
Mount Denali, standing at 20,000.
By the way, I've been watching a lot of these, like, mountaineering, summit videos. I'm fucking in love with these, man. This is a whole brand new niche that I just fucking found myself in.
1,310 feet, or 6,190 meters. Mount Denali is the highest point in North America. Compared to some of the other great mountains on Earth, though, Denali doesn't seem particularly impressive, at least at first glance. But, due to a combination of remoteness, weather, latitude, and vertical distance need to be traveled, Denali is a legendary challenge. For these reasons, the success rate of summit hopefuls is less than that of even the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest. And certainly, what would a legendary mountain be without a horrifying incident? This is the 1967 Mount Denali disaster.
Monkus. Hey, yo, man. Go subscribe to Scary Interesting if you haven't already, man. Goddamn, what a banger, bro. What a banger. And also, yeah, hey, if you like the video, and subscribe if you're new, man. Alright, let's keep going.
Today's video is brought to you by Babbel, one of the top language learning apps in the world. When I started this channel, it's just not very natural to me anymore. That's one of the reasons away from my computer and it's club among the world's highest continents. Get into today's video.
Alright, here we go.
The 7 summits are the highest points or mountains on each of the 7 continents.
Dude, that'd be so crazy to do the 7 summits, man. That'd be so wild.
Everest is Asia's highest and also the highest on Earth. Aconcagua is South America's, Elbrus is Europe's, and so on and so forth. Mount Denali is North America's highest point.
Way over here, son, in
Although it's
Alaska.
part of this exclusive 7 Summits Club among the world's highest peaks, Denali isn't particularly impressive, at least in terms of elevation. Any one of the 14 8,000 meter peaks is almost a quarter higher. Aconcagua in South America is higher, and so are many others in Asia that are only not talked about because they're overshadowed by the other giants of the region. But elevation alone isn't the full picture. Summit elevation is deceptive. It's only one of several characteristics which can drastically alter the difficulty of a climb. The first thing to note is that elevation is the height of a mountain from sea level, not from the surrounding area. If a mountain sits on a 10,000 foot plateau and then only rises 5,000 feet up from there, the visual appearance won't be nearly as impressive. So another way to measure mountains to get a true
okay, that makes
scale
sense.
for the distance needed to summit is by measuring from the base of the mountain to the peak. It's pretty simple. You're just measuring the actual mountain itself rather than the mountain plus the ground it sits on.
Which makes sense.
And incredibly, by this measure, and therefore the vertical distance mountaineers need to cover to summit the mountain, Denali is the tallest from base to peak.
What?
This means that although it's only 20,000 feet...
Wait, out of all of them, it's the tallest?
Plus the ground it sits on. And incredibly, by this measure, and therefore the vertical distance mountaineers need to cover to summit the mountain, Denali is the tallest from base to peak. This means that although it's only 20,000 feet compared to Everest's 29,000 feet, the climbable portion of Denali is actually larger.
Wow,
the base of
I didn't know
sits
that.
at around 17,000 feet and then rises to 29,000 feet from there, whereas the base of Denali starts at around...
So in reality, it's about 11,000 feet.
2,000 feet above sea level, but then rises to over 20,000, depending on where exactly...
Bro, holy! So that really puts into perspective how tall these mountains actually are, man. That's insane. So Denali as a mountain is taller than Everest, but because of the elevation distance and because Everest starts at a higher point up, wow, that's insane, man.
Exactly, the measurement is taken, climbers need to travel around 2.5 vertical miles to reach the top of Everest, but 3.5 vertical miles to reach the top of Denali. Put another way, if Denali sat on the same plateau as Everest, it would be almost 5,000 feet taller.
Look at that,
and even more incredibly, that's far from everything that makes Denali a unique challenge.
Look how vertical, like, I don't know if this is an accurate representation of the two mountains, but look how vertical Denali looks compared to Everest too, man.
At just 24 years old in 1966, Joe Wilcox had made over 50 ascents of mountains 10,000 feet or higher all across the United States. With such an impressive resume at such an early age, he started to think about what his next big climb might be. That year, he worked as a tree cutter on some of the coastal Alaskan islands near the Alaskan Panhandle and slowly his attention turned north toward the most impressive peak on the continent. Over the course of the year, the idea grew until eventually he made up his mind and began
look at
recruiting for his
Denali.
attempt at Mount Denali. As a quick note, at the
Look
time
at
it was
it,
known as
man.
Mount
Holy.
McKinley, but was later changed back to the name Denali, which was...
Wait, it was Mount McKinley? What? That sounds so... McKinley sounds so familiar. This had to have been recently changed, bro. 'Cause
near the Alaskan
McKinley sounds
Panhandle,
mad
and slowly
familiar.
his attention turned north toward the most impressive peak on the continent. Over the course of the year, the idea grew until eventually he made up his mind and began recruiting for his attempt at Mount Denali. As a quick note, at the time it was known as Mount McKinley, but was later changed back to the name Denali, which was the native name it had had for hundreds of years. In any case, Joe began by recruiting some of the mountaineers he knew, Jerry Clark and Mark McLaughlin. Jared then took over some of the recruiting process because he was older and much more entrenched in the climbing scene and knew more people who might be interested. So then while Jerry handled the people, Joe worked on the technical details of the climb. Eventually, he came up with a cost of $300 per person, or around $2,000 in today's value, to cover
Damn, it's only $2,000 in today's
the cost
value?
of food, gear, and transportation from Seattle to Alaska. Joe and Jerry then sent out a newsletter to over a dozen climbers who might be interested. In it was a full itinerary, training recommendations, and reading materials like books on avalanches and glacier travel safety. Ultimately, of those who received the letter, 6 more signed on, bringing the group to a total of 9, including the 3 original members. From there, they sent in an application to the Alaskan branch of the National Park Service, which is required by anyone looking to summit. This would be the
You have to like talk to him and be like, hey bro, we're gonna summit. You have to like
stumbling
actually
block
get
for
the
the
okay
group.
from him.
Through conversation,
I mean,
the National
makes
Park
sense.
Service realized that although the members of the group had basic mountaineering skills, none of them had experience above 15,000 feet. And because about a quarter of Denali is above that height, this would mean that they were entirely unprepared for the altitude sickness that can set in as you ascend. Because of this, park rangers
Bro, what?
recommended that they try to join with another group from Colorado who planned to make an attempt at around the same time. Joe and this group would end up speaking briefly and agreed to cooperate, but still climb independently. This was still too much of a concern for the park rangers, who were hesitant to accept their application as it was.
Yeah,
Then,
no
both
shit.
luckily
It's got all 9. Wait, what the fuck happened here? All 9 motherfuckers have never been into the fucking death zone. That's insane. And they're all about to make their own. I mean, that seems wild to me, right?
and unluckily, a member of the more experienced group was in a car accident where he broke his hand and arm.
Oh man.
This meant that he was no longer able
sucks.
to participate, and their group was now 1 short of the minimum 4 required. So rather than abandon years of planning and training and money already spent, the other group reluctantly agreed to officially team up with Joe's group. With that, park officials granted the application, stipulating that they'd need to carry radios. The more experienced members needed
So these are the 3. Damn. So the Colorado group was way smaller because they would have had 1 extra person. It would have been a total of 4. But that extra guy who broke his arm wound up joining, or wound up leaving. So these 3 joined.
supervise
wild,
less
man.
experienced members, and Joe would need to personally train his team on Mount Rainier prior to their attempt at Denali. Specifically, they'd need to practice crevasse rescue techniques for the glaciers they'd be crossing along the way. And provided they followed through on all those stipulations, they were officially allowed
On
to
Mount
climb
Rainier,
Mount
that's
Denali.
wild.
A few weeks later, at
Out there practicing on Mount Rainier, bro. I want to climb Mount Rainier. That's like one of my. Like, if I'm gonna climb a mountain, it's definitely gonna be Mount Rainier's definitely on the list.
and provided they
That's the
followed
tallest mountain in Washington. It has to be on the list, 100%.
through on all those stipulations, they were
At
officially
least I
allowed
believe
to
it's the
climb
tallest
Mount
mountain in
Denali.
Washington.
A few weeks later, at the end of June, the team was in Alaska, fully loaded with gear and ready to begin their ascent. The route they'd be taking was from the north across the Muldrow Glacier first, then up Karstens Ridge. The standard these days is from the opposite direction from the southwest across something known as the West Buttress route, after being dropped off by plane on the Kehultna Glacier. However, at the time, the Karstens Ridge route was more commonly used, in addition to being slightly cheaper because it wouldn't require the additional cost of the plane dropping them in. The trade-off is that because the approach is from the opposite direction, it's more remote. From where the roads end, the group had to trek for 3 days across mosquito-infested tundra until finally
Damn,
setting
son.
up Camp 1 at McGonigal Pass just before the Muldrow Glacier.
They were
Then,
tracking.
on June 22nd, their climb officially began.
Dude, I thought this was. Let me just point this out. I thought this, the Muldrow Glacier, I thought this was a river, bro. This is a glacier. This is ice. This is all ice. That's insane.
For the Muldrow Glacier. Then, on June 22nd, their climb officially began. Another thing about Denali which makes it so difficult is that of the 7 summits, including Everest, Denali is said to require the greatest amount of physical fitness. So to really put that into
Isn't it
perspective,
Oh no, it's not the coldest. I was gonna say, isn't it the coldest? But no, the coldest is in Antarctica, 100%. But it's got to be up there because it's so far north.
despite it lacking the death zone, which Everest has at 8,000 meters, where supplemental oxygen becomes essential, Denali is said to require the greatest amount of physical fitness. Part of the reason for this is that the vertical distance needed to travel is larger, so there's more distance.
Wait, I thought they said it was in the death zone. So Denali doesn't enter the death zone then.
So oxygen becomes essential.
I thought that's why they said that they can't go up there was because it passes this certain height or whatever the fuck, and then
Denali is said to require the greatest
watching.
amount of physical fitness. Part of the reason for this is that the vertical distance needed to travel is larger, so there's more distance spent ascending. But the main reason is that Denali is so remote and Alaska is so sparsely populated that the help available to climbers is almost non-existent. In contrast, even though Everest is in a remote region of the Himalayas, it's still situated between the 2 most populous countries on Earth. There's an entire industry of native Sherpas who provide invaluable help in carrying load after load of gear up and down the mountain. Denali has none of this, so instead the loads are carried by the climbers themselves. Like for example, during the first stage of the climb, each person will have an average pack weight of around 70 pounds or 30 kilograms, which on its own would be
70 pounds carrying uphill? Holy fuck, man.
brutal. But in addition to a heavily loaded backpack, climbers have to pull up to 150 pounds or 70 kilograms worth of gear on a sled behind them. And all of this is in addition to the large distances traveled while slowly ascending in elevation. On a typical expedition today...
Wait, why do you gotta bring so much shit with you? Why is all, like... I don't understand why you gotta bring all this extra... What is it, just tents and like, I don't understand.
The greatest distance traveled by a group in a single day would be around 5.5 miles while ascending about 1,000 feet, while also carrying and pulling all that gear.
That's insane,
Obviously, as you ascend and establish camps and eat food, these loads become lighter, but the point remains. The amount of work performed and fitness required by climbers on Denali is almost like nowhere else on Earth. As you ascend as well, this is through and around glaciers, over crevasses, and sometimes deep snow. Then at the end of a long day of traveling, camp has to be set up, and everyone has to dig, shovel, and cut snow blocks to place tents and other equipment. So that's what these men did, slowly charging their way.
Damn, dog. Gotta dig in. Holy.
Higher up the mountain, and quite literally, they walked for weeks along the same chunk of flowing ice that is the Muldrow Glacier, constantly on the lookout for deep cracks in the ground that could be the end of the expedition. First, they established Camp 2 along the lower icefall. Camp 3 was set up after that, and before another section known as the Great Icefall at the beginning of July, so close to 2 weeks after they left. Camp 4 was next and was set up below something known as the Harper Icefall at around 12,000.
So let's just say, like, they're not even beginning their ascent of the mountain, and they've already been there for 2 fucking weeks. That is brutal, man. That is real brutal. And they're in Alaska, too. Like, let's be real. Alaska's fucking... Whew! It's cold, it's snowy, it's windy, like...
Beginning of July, so close to 2 weeks after they left.
That's insane that they've been
Camp
there for
4
2
was
weeks
next
already.
and was set up below something known as the Harper Icefall at around 12,000 feet on July 4th. This icefall is part of the larger Harper Glacier and is the source of the Muldrow Glacier, which starts near the top of the mountain. It's essentially a massive chunk of flowing ice that slowly makes its way down the mountain under its own immense weight. The section of it known as the Icefall is so steep and treacherous that climbers have to ascend a ridge to the side, known as Karsten's Ridge, because it's almost completely unclimbable. After making this detour around, they set up Camp 5 along the ridge at 15,000 feet on July 13th, now close to a full month from when they started.
Damn, they've been out there for a month and they haven't even begun their ascent, and they've been out there for a month. That's insane.
From striking distance of the summit. By then, they were all suffering from some degree of altitude sickness, but for the most part, this was minor, and everything was going according to plan. That same day that they rested in camp, a weather report came through over the radio and let them know that there was a possibility of a large storm forming, which was projected to hit on the 16th or 17th. But up until that point, weather would be almost perfect for summiting. The team talked about what to do, and eventually Joe suggested that they try to make a push for the summit before the storm had a chance to hit. If they left that day, they could make high camp, then summit the next, and be down before the bad weather rolled in, and with a day to spare. After further conversation, they decided to pack 5 days worth of food and then set up one more intermediate camp at 16,500 feet to spend the night and acclimatize. This would be known as Camp 6 and would hopefully help lessen the effects of altitude sickness. So, toward the end of that day, they made the trek to this camp where they would spend the night. The following day, and for reasons that are sort of unclear, they split into 2 groups, although this may have been due to the worsening condition of some of the less experienced climbers. First was a group of 8 who would head to High Camp or Camp 7 that day. They would then make an attempt the following day on the 15th. The other 4 would remain at Camp 6 and pack some additional gear and rest before heading up to High Camp the next day. So in the evening of the 14th...
That had to have been, the reason they split into two groups had to have been, like, these guys needed to rest another day before the summit. Right? That's the only real explanation.
That group of 8 established High Camp at 18,000 feet by about 7 p.m.
Damn,
Everything
son.
was still going according to plan, and if the weather held, they'd be
18,000
standing on the
feet,
massive
holy.
summit in less than 24 hours. But then
Is the summit here, or is it here? It's here, right? I'm assuming it's here.
the following day, the group splintered further when just 4 of the strongest climbers set out at around noon for the summit. This included Joe Wilcox, another member of his party, and then 2 of the climbers from Colorado. This left another 4 at High Camp to wait for the final 4 who would be joining them later.
So essentially, the strongest climbers are like, yeah, we're gonna leave y'all behind because we're tired of fucking waiting. Let's just summit. That's kind of what it sounds like to me.
Regardless, that day, the weather was perfect. The wind was minimal, sky was clear, and the temperature was just a few degrees below freezing. Because of this, the summit team made great progress and were ascending at a rate of 500 vertical feet an hour with the occasional stop for rest and food. Finally, at 6:30 p.m., they walked across the final narrow ridge leading to the summit and stepped onto the icy top of the highest point on the continent. At the time of this ascent, only around 200
Look at
other
that,
people
bruh.
could say the same. As they stood on the little plateau, they could see over everything in every direction. There's quite literally nothing higher for thousands of miles in every direction.
That's so
With the amount of
cool,
time
man.
it had taken for them to reach the top, they wanted to savor their time, and so they spent the next hour and a half wandering the little space, talking on the radios and setting off flares in celebration. Finally, they felt it was time to descend and started down the mountain at around 8 p.m. As far north as Denali is, the sunset in July is around midnight.
At 8 p.m.? Holy. Wait, sunset in July is about midnight? Did I just hear that right? Holy shit.
And started down the mountain at around 8 p.m.
Because of the...
As far north as Denali is, the sunset in July is around midnight, so they
That's
had plenty of light
wild,
left
man.
to descend by. Even still,
did
it
not
was
even
just
know
a
that.
2-hour walk back down before they stepped into High Camp once again. Right around when the summit team returned to High Camp, the remaining group from Camp 6 arrived at High Camp, so now all 12 of the team members were at 18,000 feet. They all congratulated each other and talked about how the conditions were and what to expect. The plan at this point was still for the remaining 8 team members to summit the following day on July 16th.
I was about to say.
But when everyone woke up that morning, the wind had picked up and was getting progressively worse. Gusts were already up to 70 miles an hour. So instead of summiting that day,
Yeah,
they
so
were
you
all
start
forced to
going
hunker
down.
down in their tents and wait for the weather to clear.
Damn,
The
they
renewed
chilled
confidence
there?
they had briefly from the summit the day prior was worn down as they spent the day struggling to prepare food and shoveling snowdrifts that accumulated on their tents. With just 2 stoves for a total of 12 men, some of them just didn't eat so that they wouldn't have to walk between the tents and collect supplies in the wind. This was also partially aided by the nausea that some of them had due to the altitude sickness. At least a few of the party were already having a hard time keeping food down as it was. As the bad weather wore on, some of the less experienced climbers talked about not summiting after all, instead descending as soon as the weather cleared. After coming so far, the combination of conditions and exhaustion had almost drained them of any of the remaining spirit.
Makes sense.
But luckily again,
You gotta think, they've been out there for well over a month now, probably. It's probably been like, what, a month and a couple days? Like, whoo!
next day they woke up to the sound of nothing instead of the violent flapping of their tents from the day before. After eating and talking it over, 7 of the 8 men decided they still wanted to make a push for the summit.
Nice.
One of their party, a man named Ancho, was
Are
just
they
too
gonna do
sick
it,
to
though?
continue and would descend with the 4 men who had already summited.
I mean, that makes sense.
At around noon, that group of 5 had finished packing all their gear and set off from High Camp en route to Camp 6.
Like, goddamn, excuse me. So far, I haven't really seen anything wrong, right? Nothing has gone quote unquote wrong so far.
As they made their way down the icy
And
slopes, they
their
occasionally
decision making seems like not terrible. I mean, they were gonna go down. Weather got better. There's nothing. All right, let's try to make the ascend. This guy's not feeling good. He's gonna go down with the 4. Like everything seems
Camp 6.
pretty normal.
As they made their way down the icy slopes, they occasionally
From
looked
what I
back
know,
up
I
to
don't
check
really
on the
know
progress
shit,
of the
to be
others,
fair.
and weirdly, still by 2 p.m., they saw movement in the tents. This was later than they'd discussed, and considering that they had some of the weaker climbers in that group, just generally not a great idea to be leaving so late. In any case, the group did finally set off, but only
Damn,
with 6
man.
members instead of 7. At the last minute, another climber decided he was too sick to make the trek and would wait for them in camp. A few hours into their summit push, another storm started to form on the upper sections of the mountain.
Monka
This
ass.
was the first glimpse of not just any ordinary storm. Another reason why Denali is considered uniquely challenging is the ferocity of the storms that can develop on it. That same feature, which makes Denali so impressive visually, is responsible for creating some truly horrific conditions. When a weather system approaches from the Pacific to the south, rather than a gradual rise up a series of ascending peaks, it essentially slams into the full height of Denali. Like a large boulder sticking out of the river, wind and clouds flow roughly over and around the mountain.
Woo!
In addition to that, it's situated far closer to large bodies of water than Everest, for example, and right in the path of the polar jet stream. This current constantly brings
Man.
weather systems from the south and right over Denali.
Just insane.
And finally, it's also the
storms.
farthest north of any of the 7 summits, at just 3 degrees of latitude below the Arctic Circle, which can cause some extreme changes in temperature on top of everything else. At the worst of times, the storms in Denali are some of the worst on the planet. Sometime that evening, a radio transmission came in from the summit party and said that they were still somewhere on the upper slopes, but that they didn't know where because they were in fog and whiteout conditions. Instead, they said they were going to bivouac for the night and hope for better conditions in the morning. And for those of you who aren't aware, bivouacking is typically sleeping outside in just a sleeping bag rather than a tent. Incredibly,
That's just the worst idea I've ever heard in my life. That's just the worst idea. I'm trying to think, like, unless you, like, dig and build yourself, like, a wall or a tunnel or something to stop the wind or something that you can, like, you know? Like, that just seems like a horrible idea, right? Like, sleeping outside. Yeah, let's just sleep outside in the storm. I understand they have nowhere, like, they don't know how to get down, but, like, bro, holy fuck.
rather than a tent. Incredibly, the next transmission they sent out was at 11:30 a.m. the following morning when they were standing on the summit. Weather still wasn't great, and the winds were higher than they'd like, with
Wow,
poor
they
visibility,
made it.
but they'd made it. To top it off, the temperature was a relatively warm 6 Fahrenheit or -14 Celsius.
Oh, yeah, that's
The only
warm.
problem
Jesus
was that
Christ,
of
that's
the
so
6 that
cold.
left the
Holy
day
shit.
prior, only 5 were in the group now. A man named John Russell was unaccounted for since the night before, and it was assumed that he'd headed back down to high camp in the storm, but in all
Bro, what? They just lost one person? Holy shit. See, everything's gonna start going wrong now,
since
bro.
the night
Holy
before, and
fuck.
it was assumed that he'd headed back down to high camp in the storm, but in all honesty, no one knew if this was actually the case. This should have been far more alarming than it was, but there wasn't much they could do other than descend and hope he was there. The final transmission they sent said that they intended to leave in a few minutes, and then they'd radio once they were back at high camp. Unfortunately, shortly after that last call, the storm got dramatically worse, and it was the last time anyone ever heard from them.
Damn, man, all 5?
As they descended, a low-pressure area from the north, which brought moisture and humidity, met with a high-pressure system from the south and created a storm directly over the mountain. At the time, winds were estimated to be up to 150 miles an hour, or 240
Woo!
kilometers an hour, which on its own would be
Yeah, good luck standing. Like, good luck staying in one spot, period, bro. That's hurricane-like winds. Like, holy shit.
insane enough. This would have made it almost impossible to walk along the narrow ridgelines with all their fresh tracks being
No, it is impossible. Let's be real. It is impossible. It'd be almost impossible to stand and or walk in a straight line, period, let alone on the top of a mountain with 150-foot winds, like, or 150 mile per hour winds. Like, let's be 100% honest here. It is impossible. Like,
race they went.
holy shit.
However,
That's
later
so
modeling
horrifying.
showed that near the summit, winds could have been up to 300 miles per hour, or 480 kilometers an hour. Take these with a bit of a grain of salt, since they weren't directly measured, and because if this
Doesn't matter, bro. 150 still, you're still getting flung right off the mountain with 150 winds. If you're standing there and 150 mile per hour winds hit you, bro, there's no world where you're gonna keep your balance. You're gonna instantly fall over. That's just how it's gonna happen. I'm sorry.
was true,
There's no
this
shot.
would shatter the wind speed records on Earth. Either way, this storm is said to have been the worst experienced by any mountaineers on any mountain in the history of mountaineering.
Damn,
To go
son,
along with those
what?
brutal winds, temperatures dropped to as low as 30 degrees below zero.
Whew.
This would have made their situation completely hopeless. They wouldn't have been able to walk, let alone see in those conditions, and depending on how exposed they were on the route, they might have been struggling to even stay on the mountain. It's thought that they may have tried to bivouac about 1,000 feet from the summit, but this would have offered them no shelter from the storms. And horrifyingly, this storm would last for 4 days, except for a few small breaks.
Damn,
Even
man.
for the men at Camp 5, all they could do was wait and hope for a break in the storm to descend. The day that the second group summited was the 18th. The following day on the 19th, the storm was far too bad for anything but hunkering down in the tents and trying to survive. On the 20th, 3 of the strongest climbers from the lower group tried to go back up to
Absolutely horrifying to have X's through them like that. Like, that's just insane.
high camp and find the men, but it would take them 4 hours to travel just a half mile. The conditions were still whiteout and a fresh foot of snow had fallen, completely covering their tracks. When they were eventually forced to turn around, even their new tracks from that day still were completely erased. At midday, there was a brief break in the storm for a couple of hours, and the lower group was able to get a clear view up the mountain and the route that the upper group might have taken. But despite scanning the mountainside for a long time, there was no sign of anything. No trail, no people, no tents, and no radio transmissions would come in. It was at this point that they realized that the situation was desperate and sent an emergency radio transmission to the park ranger station. And then soon enough, the storm set in again and would continue to rage as violently as it had before. They spent the rest of the 20th and then the 21st huddled together in 2 tents. Eventually, it became so severe that all 5 men were forced into a little 3-person tent to try to stay warm.
Holy shit, man. That's absolutely horrifying.
Even still, all of their clothes were soaked and they could barely eat, drink, and sleep that night or the night of the 22nd. Then, by the morning of the 23rd, they knew that they couldn't wait in camp anymore. If they stayed any longer, they risked dying of hypothermia themselves, so at the first sign of a break in the weather, they set down from 15,000 feet. About midway across Karstens Ridge, they were met by members of the Mountaineering Club of Alaska who brought hot drinks and dry clothing. One of these members then accompanied them down as the rest of the club members continued higher in search of the missing. Finally, after over a month on Denali, they walked back into base camp on July 25th.
That's insane.
Joe Wilcox
Dude, look at that trek, first off. Like, let's just look at this trek that you have to do. Like, holy shit, man. To go so far. That's just so insane. Oh my god, man.
They walked back into base camp on July 25th. Joe Wilcox took it upon himself to travel from there to Wonder Lake to alert the ranger station and request a helicopter to pick up the others. Although they were exhausted and crushed by the loss of the rest of the party, they managed to escape relatively unscathed. Meanwhile, the storm continued to rage on until finally coming to an end on the 28th, 3 days later.
Damn,
The
son.
Mountaineering Club members
So it went for 10 days. Because they said it started on the 18th or 19th. So it went for basically 10 days.
were finally able to travel higher up and find what remained of High Camp. In it, they found the tents had been completely destroyed, the gear strewn all over the place, and there was a climber who was frozen to death, gripping onto a tent pole. Sadly, the remains couldn't be identified because of the poor condition of the body.
The last guy.
The following day, they
That was the guy who fucking waited back. That's so sad, man.
retraced the route the group had taken and found 2 more bodies at the base of an area known as Archdeacon's Tower. They were found frozen upright and in a position which seemed to indicate they were bracing against the wind. Again, the bodies were badly frozen and were in too bad a shape to be identified.
Holy shit,
Those
bro.
were the last to be found. The final 4 members of the group were somewhere on the mountain, buried or fallen into somewhere unreachable. It's even thought that the speed of the wind might have been so strong that they could have been, quite literally, blown off of Denali.
That's what I would assume would happen. Like, 150 mile per hour winds while you're standing on a ridge. Like, the math doesn't add up at all, man.
In an attempt to get closure for the families,
That's
a year later in
insane, bro.
1968, a humanitarian effort was organized to try to find and retrieve them.
In
But unfortunately,
68?
by then, even less remained. Not a single trace of any of them was ever found.
Wow.
At the time,
holy
and maybe
shit.
still currently, the 1967 Mount Denali disaster was considered to be the worst in American mountaineering history. And with the gravity of the disaster, pretty quickly there was controversy about who was to blame. Naturally, outside observers looked to the leaders of the expedition, including Joe Wilcox as the person responsible. This was only made more confusing when the surviving members started publishing books about their accounts of the events, which often conflicted with one another. Since then, at various points in time, different members have been thought to be responsible. It was only later, once the weather was modeled and the true ferocity of the storm was determined, that it absolved any of them of responsibility on the ground.
Wait, who all survived, though? I was hoping he was gonna, like, when he showed that picture, he was gonna show everyone who survived. Dude, that's fucking horrifying. Holy shit.
Grounds that no one, not even with modern weatherproofing equipment, could have survived what was occurring on the upper slopes.
Yeah.
It was, and still is, the worst storm ever recorded on Mount Denali. Hello
Man,
everyone,
holy
thank you
shit.
all so much for watching, welcome to Scary Interesting, and once again, a huge thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video.
Huge thank you to Babbel. God damn, man, holy shit. Well, that was fucking insane. Why No Life Shack pop up? I don't understand why. Like, what's this YouTube bug? What is this glitch where I do show more and another channel that I watch pops up there? It's so weird. I don't understand that. Goddamn. And it completely throws me off of what I was gonna say about the video that I was watching. It's really annoying, actually, because now I don't even remember what I was gonna say, man. That was a crazy one. Hey, yo, make sure to go subscribe to Scary Interesting if you haven't already, man. God damn, man. God damn. Hey, yo, if you liked the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll catch you next time, man. Deuces.